So when you go on vacation, you probably spend about maybe a week or two traveling, sightseeing, doing all the touristy things, right? You do all the stereotype touristy attractions, like you find those little stands for the little knickknacks or tchotchkes, and you take it home with you as a little memento for your long trip. But with all vacations, there comes a day. It is the saddest day, and yet it's also the best day. It's the day you come home. It's the saddest day because, well, it means the vacation is over. But it's the best day because, well, you're back home. You get to come home to your bed. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I go on vacation, it can be tough getting used to the beds at a hotel. Like sometimes it might take me a night or two to get used to it. And then by the time I'm used to it, the vacation is over and then we go home to our own bed. You get to come home to your friends. You get to tell them all of your adventures. You get to show them all the pictures. You get to show them the little souvenirs you got. Telling them all the fun stories that you did. But also, probably one of the reasons is that, well, the money is all ran out. You've saved up for months, probably even a couple of years, trying to go on this big vacation, and well, the money's all ran out, and well, you spend it all on souvenirs and tchotchkes and all that stuff, and so it's now time to come home. So maybe you can start saving for the next vacation. But what if you don't come home for decades? Let's think about that. You're away from home for years and years. But I'm not talking about being away on vacation. I'm talking about what if you're in exile and you're not allowed to go home? In fact, it's possible you may never see home again. And so you tell your sons, your daughters, your grandchildren about your home, all the fun things in your house, maybe stories about the dining room table of all the conversations you had at dinner time or all the homework that was done at that table. You tell them about all the fun 4th of July parties that you had in your backyard with friends and family. Because it's possible that one day those children will be able to see those homes, but you might not see home again. And today in Nehemiah chapter 7, we're going to be taking a look at the return of the Israelites from exile, a lot of which have never seen Jerusalem. They've heard about it all from their families that started the exile, but those who are coming into Jerusalem probably have never even seen this city before. We're looking at Nehemiah chapter 7, where people are coming home. The Jewish people are finally coming home to the holy city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, known as the city of peace. People are finally coming home. Now, with Nehemiah chapter 7, your initial look at it, it might be like, Tim, it's just another list again. Didn't we go over this back in chapter 3 where we just had a long list of names? And yes, we did that in Nehemiah chapter 3. And in here, we have more than just names. We also have numbers as well. So we get all the people as well as all the numbers. So I think it works out. It's more than just a list. There's still applicable lessons that we can find here in Nehemiah chapter 7. Just like with Nehemiah chapter 3, how we found a lot of lessons there, we still find a lot of applicable lessons here in Nehemiah 7. So, as we get into Nehemiah 7, let's take a look at our first point here, which is setting up leaders. So, Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, it says this: After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, then the singers and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men do. Verse 3, I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some of their posts and some near their own homes. So we see here that the gates are finally put up. They're finally assembled. If you remember last week with Nehemiah 6, Nehemiah said that the walls were built, but the gates weren't set up yet. That was the only thing left to do. But in Nehemiah 7, the gates are finally put up. So the wall is truly 100% done. Not only the walls are completed, but the gates into the city are completed. And in here, we see that Nehemiah is appointing gatekeepers. He's appointing gatekeepers is because, well, the city is still, it can still be attacked at any time. Because if you remember, there were people in the previous chapters that are still looking to attack. Even though the walls were built, they wanted to attack. They wanted to end Nehemiah's reign there. They wanted to just get rid of him completely. And so the attack might still come out. And so we still have gatekeepers for the city. But he also appointed Levites. He appointed singers. The singers would be put at the temple for praise and worship. And so Nehemiah appointed these leaders for the temple as well as keeping the city secure. But more than that, he also appointed commanders of the citadel. This is the big structure, a big fortress that is typically in the middle of the city, probably like kind of like the last stand in a way. But it was also probably very close to the temple or maybe within the temple itself. And who do we see that Nehemiah appoints as the commanders for the citadel? His brother Hanani. You probably remember that name. If you don't, that's okay. He was in Nehemiah chapter 1. He came all the way from Jerusalem to Susa to tell Nehemiah that the city was in disgrace. So he was the one who told Nehemiah the news of the city. And now we see him again as one of the governors, as one of the commanders, sorry. And then we see Hananiah. He's also another commander. And the reason why Nehemiah appointed him is because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men. So we see Nehemiah, he's getting all of these leaders set up. He is appointing all these appropriate people for the leadership. You see, he couldn't run the city by himself. He needed other leaders. He needed other people to run other things. So he delegated responsibilities to other people, but he didn't just pick random people. He picked those who he can trust. He selected people that were godly people that had most likely the same vision as he did. And what was Nehemiah's vision? To praise God, to keep the city running. Because even though these walls were built, that didn't mean that Nehemiah was just going to be like, okay, I'm done. Bye, guys. I'm going to go back to Susa. I'm going to be the cupbearer once again for King Artaxerxes. No, just because the walls are built doesn't mean his job was done. It's just like when you order a pizza, for an example. Just because you call the call the restaurant, you order the pizza, they made the pizza. Well, the job is not done yet. The pizza still had to be delivered to your house, or you got to go pick it up. There's more to than just making the pizza. Here, it's more than just building up the walls. It's now getting the city, the people organized. So at the big, with these first 6 chapters, it was about building up the walls, physical, the building up Jerusalem physically, but now it's bringing in the people, bringing in the people. And so then that's our first point. So Nehemiah was setting up leaders to help them get everything organized, to get things prepped and ready for people coming back from exile. And the second point here today, he's setting up citizenship. This is verses 4 through 69. So I know that's a long section of verses. I'm not going to read that whole thing. I will read the first few verses here. All right. So starting in verse 4, now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for the registration of families. I found the geological record of those who had been the first to return. This is what I found to be written there. And so starting from verse 6 and then all the way down through 69, we see a big long list of different names as well as people. This is people groups, as well as the number of people from that family. These are the people returning from exile. Now, beginning of the section, we see that the city of Jerusalem was big and spacious. That meant that there were most likely not a lot of people living in this city, even though technically Jerusalem is, I guess, technically a small city compared to nowadays. During this time, it was probably an average sized city, but because there were so few people living in the city, that means it's still possible for an attack. And so people are trying to come into the city, but also Nehemiah needed to make sure that everything was prepped and ready for the city properly. Now, reflecting back from our previous point here, people couldn't just come in all willy-nilly. They couldn't just start coming in because obviously the gates were all set up. The gates were only going to be open for a certain time window. So just reflecting back from the first point, we see that Nehemiah in verse 3, he said, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers were still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their houses. So looking at that first verse 3 there, Nehemiah says that you are not to open the gates until the sun is hot. What does that mean? Well, that simply means to don't open it until the sun's out and it's hot, probably around midday, right? That's when it's hottest. You see, normally the gates would be open like around dawn, like at the beginning of a workday, when people start coming in, trying to get in early and everything. But Nehemiah knew that's probably during a time where maybe his enemies can slip in, because that's where it's still kind of dark and people can really see who's who. So when the sun is out and it's brightest, that's the least vulnerable time for a city to be attacked. And so then going back to the point we got now, and so as people are going to be coming in, they couldn't just come in and start making camp. You couldn't just be like a random person, be like, yeah, I just want to live in Jerusalem now, and that's it. See, people had to be registered. They had to have some type of genealogy. They had to be Jewish. You see, Nehemiah was building this city to be, again, this is the holy city for the people of the Jewish for the Jewish people. And Nehemiah wanted to have it filled with Jewish people, and not just because the people understood the past in terms of the genealogy of the blood, because they understood everything that happened in the past, but it's the hope for the future. It's the understanding about the 400 years in Egypt as slaves. It's about understanding all these years in exile. It's about conquering the land back in the book of Joshua. But it's also the hope for the future, understanding that there is hope for them in the future for a coming Messiah. And so that's what Nehemiah wanted to do. Wanted to make sure that these people understood, like, hey, you have to be Jewish. I want you to be like, I want you to have the same vision as we all do here today. And so, with all this long list of names, this very long list of names and numbers, we see that there's a total of 49,942 people. And with this, we have families, we have priests, Levites, we have the people that are going to be in charge of the temple. We also even have temple servants. The temple servants were probably a mixture of maybe prisoners of war, or maybe even descendants of the Gibeonites, sorry. For those who don't know, the Gibeonites, in Joshua chapter 9, we see that when the Israelites were still wandering around trying to conquer the land, the promised land, the Gibeonites tricked Joshua, they tricked the Israelites. And so when the Israelites realized that they were tricked, then the Gibeonites, they agreed to become the slaves of the Israelites. And so they then became the slaves. And so now we get probably the descendants of the Gibeonites here as the temple servants. So again, and that's in Joshua, in the book of Joshua, particularly in Joshua chapter 9. That's where we see the Gibeonites. If you're ever interested and want to look at it yourself, I encourage you to do so. We also see descendants of Solomon's servants that are coming back here into Jerusalem. But then what do we also see? We saw priests, but we also see there were priests without the genealogy, without proper genealogy, and they were disqualified from being priests. So I know that might sound a little mean, a little judgmental, or maybe just a little too strict, thinking like, wait a second, these people were priests. Why can't they just be priests and that's fine? If they just want to work in the temple, that's okay. But the problem was, if they couldn't prove it, then they can't work at the temple. And this was actually a part of the law, we find this in the first 5 books of the Bible, where God actually gave the instructions that it was meant to be Aaron, aka the brother of Moses, who was the first priest. Aaron and his sons were to take care of the temple, take care of the sacrifices. And there was a very strict list that they had to follow for the people who could make the sacrifices to go into the temple and do all that. And if you weren't one of the descendants, if you don't have that proper authority, not just from a human perspective, from God's, if you don't have his blessing, you are given that authority, then you could die. Now, if you remember from last week, we saw this in Nehemiah chapter 6, where Nehemiah was actually being tricked by a priest who said, like, hey, how about you go hide in the temple? Go lock yourself in the temple so you can keep yourself safe. But Nehemiah said, no, I'm not going to hide in the temple. There was 2 reasons for that. One, it was just because of character reason. But number 2, it's because he wasn't a descendant of Aaron. He wasn't a priest. He didn't get that special authority from God. He knew that if he were to do that, then he could die himself. And so it might seem like these people are being picky, on these priests that don't have the specialty paperwork, they don't have the proper blood work as we probably do nowadays. You can send in your blood work and you can figure out like the last like 20 generations of your life. They didn't have that at this time. And so if you can't prove it, well, then you can't be a priest. I know it sounds mean, but it's also like, hey, we're just trying to keep you safe. We just don't want you to die. And then we have less people working here in Jerusalem. And then we also here have, so of the 49 plus thousand people, we have over 7,000 men servants and maid servants. And we also have 245 singers. Now, these singers, they would help maintain the worship at the temple. There was not a whole lot of singing during the time of exile. There was not a whole lot of extra worshiping and sacrificing to during the time of exile. But now these singers are going to now be a crucial part at the temple. And we're going to see a lot more of the singers later on in this book here, in this book of Nehemiah. And so getting all these citizens here, getting all of them registered, we now get into setting up worship. We see the people setting up worship. This is our last point here today. This is in verses 70 through 73a. So the first half of verse 73, verse 70 through 73a, where we see the setting up of worship. Now, I'm going to start off by reading that here. So starting in verse 70, some of the heads of the families contributed to the work. The governor gave to the treasury 1,000 drachmas of gold. Now, what is a drachmas? What are drachmas? Well, it's a small coin. It's a small coin that was used during this time frame. And one of those coins probably weighed roughly 3/10 of a pound. But we see he gave 1,000 of these small gold coins. So 1,000 of them probably would weigh about 19 pounds. That's a lot of gold, isn't it? That's a lot of money that is used for the treasury, for the work at the temple. That's what this is meant to be used for, the work at the temple. As well as, and we also see there were 50 bowls and 530 garments for the priests. Some of the heads of the families gave to the treasury for the work 20,000 drachmas. 20,000 drachmas. That would probably weigh about 375 pounds. That's a lot. Now, some of your Bibles might say darics, D-A-R-I-C-S. Some Bibles might say that, but it's the same thing. Drachmas and darics, they're the same thing, just a different word. But we see, so we see 20,000 drachmas of gold and 2,200 mains of silver. The total given by the rest of the people was 20,000 drachmas of gold, 2,000 minas of silver, and 67 garments for the priests. So we see here that people are giving what they can for the worship at the temple, for the priests, the Levites, to have what they need for the temple, for them to preach the word, to maintain the word. But also these garments, they weren't just like simple, like little bits of clothing here or there. It wasn't second down clothes. It wasn't like, oh, they just went to Goodwill and bought t-shirt, jeans, some socks and shoes, and then just brought it to the temple. No, these garments are specialty garments. It was a very strict rules of what the garments are to be, what are they to look like, what are the priests to wear, how to wear it. And we see this a lot in the law. We see this through Exodus, Leviticus, and like all through the Pentateuch, aka the first 5 books. So these garments here, they're not just hand-me-downs. They're not just like, oh yeah, here's some random material. No, these are specialty garments for the priests. And that's what the people gave. We see the heads of the families, all these families here, all the 49,000 plus people were giving what they had for the worship of God. And even though with all these numbers, with all this random lists of people for now a second time in the book of Nehemiah, what does this truly mean for us today? Is this even important again with all these names and numbers? First one is that we need godly leaders. That's our first point today. We need godly leaders. We can't just have random people just take charge of the situation. Because, like I said, we had over 49,000 people that were coming into the city. Do you think Nehemiah could have done it all himself? No. What if there were problems that Nehemiah had to take care of? What if there were organization problems? What if people weren't going to the right place? What if people needed more help? So Nehemiah had to appoint proper leaders, proper godly leaders to help him in this situation. We saw this in verse 3, or I'm sorry, in verse 2, where Nehemiah appointed his brother as well as Hananiah for the commanders of the citadel. Hananiah, he was a man of integrity who feared God. And that still applies to us to this day, that we can't just appoint a random person in ministry. We got to appoint people, godly people, as leaders. But then also what we see today is that people are important to God. People are important to God. Friends, this is a very detailed list. It's not just a thing that says there were 49,000 people that came back to Jerusalem after exile. No, there was a detailed account here. Friends, I know this is a very long list and there's names here that, yeah, it's very difficult to pronounce. You might find a couple words that you might know, but friends, this list is very important. This is a very detailed account because people are important to God. In fact, we even see this in the beginning of Scripture where we see God made people in his image. He wants these records to be kept for us today. People are important to God. We see the mention of families, the mention of Levites, priests, servants, descendants of Solomon's servants here in this list. We even see a list of priests who are disqualified from being priests because they don't have proper genealogy. Their names are listed here. But that doesn't mean they're not important to God. People are important to God. And Nehemiah wanted that to be his main focus as people were coming in. To bring these people back to Jerusalem, to make them important, to make sure that they had the right people from, not just in the bloodline, but also people who had the same hope of a coming Messiah. Let us pray.